family with several other genera, something like 8. But it's the Phrynosomity. So there's this nested hierarchy of species. This is one species in the broader genus Phrynosoma. They're in the family Phrynosomity. And then there's a broader classification, even larger, of lizards. One of the things that unites lizards is they have keratinized scales on their bodies. So when you think about lizard scales, they're different than fish scales or other scales that you might find on other kinds of organisms, but they're made of keratin and they're produced by the dermal layer or the epidermal layer?
They're epidermal scales.
Epidermal keratin scales. Keratin is a protein, a structural protein, but it's quite hard and it serves well for a variety of things, including keeping their water balance, keeping the water they have inside them. So that's that's part of the basic body plan of being a lizard, is having keratinized scales. But what you'll see is in a different species, those keratinized scales are modified in different ways. And that's important for understanding the nature of the horns on these lizards, their modification of the scales. The other player is the loggerhead shrike, which is here. So loggerhead shrikes are carnivorous. They hunt and eat various animals, including lizards in the desert Southwest. But they're not closely related to the first bird that usually comes to your mind when you think of a predatory bird. When you think of a predatory bird eating mammals as prey, what do you think of? Eagles, hawks, right? Falcons, these kinds of things.
Falcons.
So here's an example of a falcon. And there is some similarity here. It's a result of convergence, of adaptations to similar lifestyles. For example, the hooked beak. These are actually songbirds. They're more closely related to blue jays and crows and other perching birds, which is something like 6,000 some species of birds. Most birds you think of singing and perching in the trees and stuff like that, going to your bird feeder, are going to be passerine birds, which are characterized by, among other things, the architecture of their feet. So they don't have talons. The nature of the joints where the 4 digits come together aren't such that they have talons like most falcons. So they have a behavioral adaptation for handling prey. What's that behavioral adaptation? The kind of gruesome behavioral adaptation that they use to identify shrike-killed lizards? Yeah, they impale them. A falcon like this doesn't need to do that. It's got talons for grasping. It can hold them. It can hold the animal down and really pull to get those muscles and tendons and things, right? But the perching birds don't have the feet for that. So they use the impaling as a behavior not only to help them feed, but also as a place to store food for later. So that's the difference between falcons and a passerine or perching songbird modified for a predatory lifestyle. Of all the songbirds, they're more closely related to like I said, the blue jays and the and crows, corvids. All right. So then we did a little bit of vocab last time, and we talked about. Let's see where the premises for evolution by natural selection. I want you all to know these 4 premises or preconditions from which natural selection follows. So if we think about evolution as descent with modification, so descending from ancestors to descendants through generations, and then modifying the average traits of organisms in those populations as time goes by, this is all you need to get that modification. This doesn't explicitly address speciation. Of course, Darwin did in the book on the origin of species, hence the title. But this just looks at a mechanism for adaptation by natural selection. If these 4 things are happening, the consequence is modification or adaptation. But there's another way to think about natural selection. It's descent with modification. You can either memorize these 4, or you can try to think about it graphically. So if you think of yourself as a visual learner, or you just like having multiple ways of thinking about things. Another way that you can think about this stuff, since that's recording, let's pull this up, is so phenotype, remember we defined that last time? It's the outward expression of the genetic makeup of organisms. It's the physical, behavioral, or chemical attributes of an organism. That's what varies in a population. So we all vary in our height, we might vary in our hair color, we might vary in some aspect of the modified scales on a horned lizard. And one of the preconditions here is this differential fitness consequences. Right? What were the two ways we could think about fitness or fitness consequences? Do you guys remember? Or how did they measure fitness in this paper? Yeah.
Whether they survived or not.
Good. And why is survival important for natural selection? Yeah.
Because if you survive, you can reproduce.
Yeah. So survival is one thing you can measure to get at variation in how much different organisms in the population are reproducing. The ones that survive have the opportunity to reproduce. You could also just measure how their production of offspring varies, if you want to know about variation within those that survive. But in this case, they just used survival. So there could be some measure of fitness. Fitness is this broad concept that's kind of hard to measure, but we measure different surrogates of fitness, different variables that are easy to measure that substitute in for fitness. So then you have this graphical space where you can think about evolution by natural selection. It's the relationship between the average or the range of phenotypes in a population, some properties of that distribution, and the fitness. So it could be that, so at some high value and some low value, you have different fitness consequences. In fact, that's the fourth point, right? Differential fitness. That could be a prediction of selection. Differential fitness consequences based on variation in a phenotype among a population. You find this line by measuring fitness and phenotype, and that gives you points in this graphical space. In the case of this paper, the points are kind of funny. We don't have the same continuous range of fitness values, so all these points come along the line here, come along the y-axis. We have only two possible values. You're either shrike killed, impaled on a barbed wire fence or a thorn, or you're alive and they caught you when they measured your head as a lizard, assuming you're the lizard, right? So what that means is they found a bunch of lizards that were alive, and some of them had these values for their phenotype, and they found a bunch of lizards that were dead. And they knew why they died because they were impaled, right? So how do you get a relationship if your y-axis is categorical? Well, this is the graph I want you guys to be able to read. They did a logistic regression and fit a spline. So basically, this is a curved line. It could have any curve to it. They used a spline, which allows you to have a line or a parabola or something with even more orders of exponents, right? It could be x cubed, x squared, whatever. But anyway, they fit a spline here, and the position of this line along the y-axis depends on the density of points where you are on the x-axis. So if there's a whole lot of points here on the low side of the phenotype, and these are all the dead ones, that's going to tend to pull the line down this way. Whereas over here at the high side of the phenotype, there's a lot higher density, so that pulls the line, the best fit y up. So you get this kind of a surface. And it's just kind of modeling the probability of finding alive or dead based on this phenotype. That's how you read the graph. This is a selection surface. Or this relationship we can sometimes call a selection surface. Think of it as being a hill that you can climb or descend. You okay? Does anyone remember how they measured the strength of selection? This was a little more of a quantitative part and not sort of an overarching idea of the paper, but I wonder if anyone picked it up. What metric did they use to measure selection? So horn length is the phenotype. Well, horn length is part of the phenotype. Horn length. Actually, let's explore that a little bit and I'll come back to my first question. Was it just raw horn length? Or was there something different about it? Something modified or adjusted? Yeah.
It was like some combination of horn length and like the size of the lizard.
Yeah, the size of the lizard. Right, good. And I want to build on that. That's correct. I would modify that. It wasn't exactly a combination, but those two things are important. Yeah.
They also had two different ones.
Oh, yes, for sure. So that's why, so this particular graph shows parietal horn length, right? So that's these in the back. There's another plot in there that you saw, right, has the squamosals. You guys remember this graph? This is another relationship. So go first to the axes. How big is the head? How long are the horns? And the residual is represented by the yellow line here. It's the difference in the observed horn length of an individual lizard and what you would expect on this kind of model of horn head size to horn size across the whole population. So you could be a little longer horns than expected or a little shorter horn than expected. And that difference is what they used here. Residual. That's the yellow line. And then this sort of tells you which horns, and then it's the horn length. This surface this relationship can be described either by the original equation or it can be summarized by this beta. This is what matters here. This is their strength of selection metric. Let's see. So, okay. This is basically just telling you, given the amount of variation in horn length, how strong is the effect of shrike killing on your ability to predict whether the lizards are alive or dead. Okay, so before I go to this discussion, let's return one more time to these conditions. So let me ask you to discuss for a moment, did the authors of this study in creating that selection surface and measuring the horn length and comparing all these things, did they successfully demonstrate that the lizards are evolving in response to selection by the loggerhead shrikes? Did they convince you that's what's happening?
I would say so.
You would say so, why?
Because the ones with the shorter horns are getting killed more often, leaving the ones with the longer horns surviving and being able to reproduce.
Good. That's a good take. Anybody else want to add to that or disagree or anything else? In order to demonstrate evolution by natural selection, you have to have these four conditions met. Did they demonstrate to you that those four conditions are met in this case? I see a lot of positive head nodding. Did they show that the horn length is heritable?
That's just kind of assumed.
Good. It's just sort of assumed. It's a background information. you're a biologist, you've been reading about these things, you know that certain quantitative traits that vary in a population are often heritable. Not always. As a plant biologist, we see all kinds of plasticity in development that may have nothing to do with genetics. The amount of light something a plant gets might affect its height, and so it would be a much weaker assumption with something like plant height compared to horn length, something like that. Did they show this variation among the individuals for horn length? Yeah, that's in the graph, right? Did they show that novel individuals survive and reach full reproductive potential?
Yeah.
Yeah, good. And differential fitness consequences with respect to the trait of interest? Here's one thing that I was going to do at the very beginning and I didn't think to do it. We'll show you guys this picture one more time. They had some sense that there would be differential fitness consequences, not just because they saw the lizards impaled, but also they occasionally observed evidence of unsuccessful predation attempts by loggerhead shrikes on these lizards. In this figure, if you read the caption, the lizard is doing a defensive display where it's sticking its horns out, where they're better able to get a loggerhead shrike in the eyeball, and let the loggerhead shrike know, if you come get me, I'll stab you in the eyeball. But back here, it's got a wound from an unsuccessful attack, where the loggerhead shrike went for it, but the lizard was able to get away. So this adaptation works quite well, given the behavior of the shrikes to successfully get their prey by going for the neck. All right. So you'll see this quite a bit in scientific papers where there's a broad overarching topic, in this case something like, is there selection on lizards by loggerhead shrikes for a trait of interest, in this case horn length. And some of the things will be demonstrated, and some of it will be assumed or be referred to in previous literature. In this case, heritability wasn't demonstrated, but there's good reason to think that that's part of the study. So the second question, the final question before we move on to Galapagos is, why do you think the authors thought this would be a good paper for the journal Science? There's lots of scientific journals out there, and they vary in how broad their audiences are, how many people read them in different fields. Why do you guys think something like Science, that's very broadly read, was a good choice for this study, or why did they think it was a good choice? They sort of tell you in the beginning.
It's like just accepted as fact. They're kind of going with that.
They talk about these just so
Yeah, the
stories,
just
right?
so thing.
Yeah. So oftentimes people see something that looks like it'd be an adaptation, and it's just that you can phrase it that way, and then people just accept it as the case. What do we do with just those stories in order to treat them as a scientist would treat them? We can think about them as hypotheses. Right? The hypothesis is the answer to a question. What's this thing for? Well, it's an adaptation to X. That's your answer, which is your hypothesis, which is the start of the scientific process, not the end. Right? Why else? They talked about other studies that looked at survivors and killed organisms. What was different about this one? Normally, this would be the same day that you just read the paper, and I realize that it's been like 4 or 5 days. The important thing here is that they're not just going out and collecting dead bodies and measuring them for horn length. They know exactly why it died. They know the agent of selection. And if you were to just Google these premises of evolution by natural selection, you might get a little bit less detail, but what's important here is that there's a trait of interest when you think about an adaptation, in this case horn length, and the differential fitness consequences are with respect to the trait of interest. There might be other things that they vary in, that vary among the survivors that could then evolve, but those wouldn't be adaptations. They would just be other kinds of modifications that come along with evolution. In this case, we're looking at a specific trait of interest and selection acting on that trait, and then that trait being modified in response. So having the agent of selection easily identifiable as Shrikes was the important part for this paper. That seem okay? When you go back and look at it, if you're using it to study or something, look to see where they talk about previous studies that did these kinds of comparisons but didn't know exactly why the organisms died in all cases. And you'll see also, I think, maybe, Paul, maybe you made this?
I
This
did.
one? Yeah, so you can compare your concept map, as you're going back over things, to a concept map like this one. It's not important that everyone's concept map looks the same. It's just a matter of does it flow and can you follow it and can you remember what information you're including when you look back at it a week later or something.
And keep in mind, there are aspects of this concept map that we wouldn't expect to see in yours, because a lot of that stuff on the right-hand side is actually me thinking ahead. So if horned lizards are being selected on by shrikes, is that then feeding back on shrike evolution such that shrikes are being shaped by horned lizards, perhaps to have larger beaks or something like that? So there's this possibility of what we call reciprocal selection, and that's kind of what
That's what is going
what
on up here.
that is going on up there, and I wouldn't expect you guys to be thinking about that. That's the difference between your stage of training versus our stage of training. That's the difference there. So don't worry about that.
In what I've just gone over today before we go on to the Galapagos, talking a little bit more about this graph, the goal here was to preview stuff that's coming in other studies. Just like talking about reciprocal selection back here, had Paul been doing today's lecture, would have been previewing things to come. So we try to do that for you guys.
Yeah, we're going to study a predator-prey interaction where the predator selects on prey and the prey exerts selection back on the predator. And so that's coming at the end of this semester.
Okay. So you guys watched the Galapagos video, right? You all have some things you thought were interesting about it? Okay, good. Let's collect those at the end. Just set them up here on your way out. That way you have them in case you want to share one of them while we talk today. Here's what I want to be able to do with the Galapagos today. So the Galapagos Islands are the setting for the next case study. Hopefully you've all had a chance to see the Hendry et al. Paper on Moodle. Start reading it, get into it, be familiar with it. You can read it multiple times, and we'll continue to discuss it. But today we just want to get you guys familiar with the setting, because the Galapagos are more than just finches.
I put a thing on the Moodle site
Yeah.
that directs you towards resources on the Moodle site that will be useful for you as you start reading Hendry et al. Because Monday you have the draft of the introduction.
Oh, already? Yeah.
Yeah,
So
Monday the
today's
13th is the
Wednesday.
draft of the introduction.
Yeah.
You don't have to do the whole paper, but you need to do the introduction. One-page draft. Once again, the instructions are on Moodle, so be sure and take a look at
I
that.
suggest read it over a couple times, take some notes on the paper, put the paper away, and then try to summarize the introduction based on your notes and what you remember. That's about a page for the intro. This will be the more typical structure of a scientific paper. So far, the two you've read are these condensed science or nature formats. This is that classic introduction, methods, results discussion, at least in terms of the headings. We'll talk about some funniness about it in class. So, can someone tell me where the Galapagos Islands are?
Right on the equator,
Right on the equator. That's a pretty big circumference.
they're off the coast of Ecuador.
Off the coast of Ecuador in South America, right? So right about there. That's the Galapagos. They're about 1,000 kilometers off the coast of Ecuador, and they're almost due south of Kansas City. So we're at about, 94 degrees west? These are about 91. So even though they're off the west coast of Ecuador, they're almost straight south of us, right on the equator. They're a large archipelago, so there's like 13 large or medium-sized islands and dozens of smaller ones, little rocky seamounts and stuff like that. And it's an island chain. Let me see if I can get the light off so that you can see this a little bit. They're volcanic. You might be more familiar with Hawaiian Islands, but these are volcanic islands, kind of like Hawaii. And there are active volcanoes here on these two islands. These are the youngest islands, and the ones down here are a bit older. That's because deep in the Earth's mantle, under the crust, there's a hot spot where basically the flow of heat through the mantle is such that the crust is warmer here and thinner and volcanically active. Meanwhile, the crust, which is above the mantle, shifts around. There are many different plates. And where those plates meet, they're either diverging and creating new oceanic crust, or they're converging, creating either subduction or mountain ranges. In this case, we're near a three-way junction of diverging plates. So the Galapagos Islands are on the Nazca Plate, which is moving generally this way. That arrow is a little steep. I've adjusted that a little bit. You can kind of tell because of the islands themselves. So deep under the crust, the hot spot is roughly stationary, but the plate is sliding over the top. So as a consequence, we get older islands back here and younger islands over the current location of the hot spot on the plate. So older that way. So these form as volcanoes initially. Seamounts that become exposed and then continue to grow as the volcanoes are active. What happens to a volcano or an island or a mountain over time? I heard a couple answers, but speak up a little more. We'll start in the back and come up here. What did I hear? Erosion, and you were going to say? Uh-huh. So initially they get bigger, they grow. That's why these are the youngest ones. And then as they drift past the hot spot, the next thing that happens is erosion. So there's variation in the topography of these islands, where the younger ones are larger and the older ones have a lower profile. And that has consequences for their climate. These are shield volcanoes. Shield volcanoes are different than explosive, what are the continental volcanoes called? Well, we're going to talk about other volcanoes. In the oceans, these kinds of volcanoes are made primarily of basaltic rock, and it tends to flow gently, continuously, erupting for many, many years, and creating these really low slopes. And the eruptions aren't very explosive. They don't create big pyroclastic lava flows or something like that. Whereas on the continents, when you have volcanoes, there's different kinds of rock, and those rocks trap gas and water, leading to more explosive eruptions. These are kind of more gentle. The other aspect of the Galapagos that relates to their climate, besides their topography, is their geographic location, which you all told me at the beginning is around the equator. So on the equator, over the course of a year, from January to December, locations on the equator tend to get around the same amount of incoming solar radiation. It varies a little bit if you're just above or below the equator, partly because the Earth itself is tilted, so as it rotates and revolves around the sun, we get small fluctuations annually. But it's generally pretty stable, right? It's within a narrow band. We're at about 39 degrees north latitude, so we can use the 40 here. I just told you the answer to that. I was going to ask you guys, why do you think that the 40-degree line is so steep? But even though I just said it, let's just see if you guys can put it in your own words. Why are the lines steeper as you go to higher and higher latitudes? Let's go over here, and we'll come back. Yeah.
Certain seasons, the sun has less ability to hit where you're directly hit where you're at.
Good. Yeah, so it has to do with seasonality, it has to do with incoming solar radiation. That's right. Why at high latitudes in the northern hemisphere do we get less light? Why? So that's the right answer, but why is that? Yeah.
Because the axis is tilted.
Yeah, the axis of the Earth is tilted, good, tilted about 23.5 degrees, such that I should have brought my little model. I'll bring it next time. So that's a day, right? One rotation. Here's your equator. And if you're in the northern hemisphere, up here, the incoming solar radiation is hitting you at a very kind of shallow angle. Whereas if you're on the equator, it's coming pretty much direct from straight above. Conversely, if you're on the other side of the year, other part of the other season, and you're in the northern hemisphere, there's your day. Every time it's day, you're getting that more direct sunlight. And the equator still is too. So that's why you get this variation here. And you'll see this again as well. But just because you get the same amount of sunlight all year doesn't mean you have this constant climate all year. The climate is strongly affected by ocean currents. And you can see the broad scale patterns of the Pacific Ocean here. We've got the Peru current bringing cool water from the southern Pacific up towards the equator, water from the northern Pacific down towards the equator, where you have these equatorial currents and countercurrents going past each other and under each other in 3 dimensions. And there's the Galapagos, influenced by the Peru, the Panama equatorial currents. Here's a closer up look at that. So during part of the year, the Galapagos lies kind of in the path of the Peru current and this south equatorial countercurrent, which is a deep water current. It's not at the surface, it's deep underwater. And when that hits the Galapagos Islands, which are a series of mountains underwater, it brings that cool water up to the shores of the Galapagos, to the coral reefs and things around it. So there's the Peru. In addition to having cool water coming from the south here, the coast of South America causes that same upwelling that I just described here. Cool water that's deep in the ocean rises when it hits the continent and comes towards the surface. And that's why this is one of the most productive coastlines in the world. If you want to go fishing, or if you just want to see the abundance of shorebirds, the coast of South America is a remarkable place because there's so much nutrients being brought up from the deep ocean to feed plankton near the surface. That becomes the foundation of a rich food chain. And so the Galapagos gets kind of the double benefit of the upwelling off the coast of South America and also its own upwelling from the countercurrent. So we talked about temperature. Let's consider rainfall as well. See how that varies over the course of a year. Temperature for each month is shown here with a minimum and a maximum. So your January maximum temperature is going to be about 28, just shy of 28 degrees centigrade, and the coolest time of the day is something like 23. And there's some confidence intervals here. This is taken over the course of several years. It says up here how many years. I think it's like 10 years of data. You can see it fluctuates a bit, but we're always somewhere between 64 and 92. Sounds pretty nice, right? It's a great place to go and do research. If you're interested in finches or tortoises or all kinds of interesting plants, there's lots of biological research happening at Galapagos, and students sometimes go. In fact, I think we had a dual student before me who went down there for a project.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That contrasts with the variation in rainfall. So notice that there is a distinct wet season and a dry season. What else do you notice about this wet season, dry season graph?
Does this like goes with the temperature?
It does kind of go with the temperature for sure, right? The slightly warmer season also is the slightly wetter season. That should make some sense, right? More humidity, the atmosphere holds more heat, higher heat index. What else do you notice about this graph? Yeah.
It's like a cycle.
For sure. It's definitely an annual cycle. Right after December comes January, so you can imagine putting this one right there, for sure. Good. We're revolving around the sun. Right? Anything else? Yeah.
It's weird that between January and March, February dips
Between January.
in March.
Oh, here. Oh, this dip here. Yeah, that dip is kind of weird, but I wouldn't put a whole lot of stock into that dip because this is about 10 years or less of data. Besides the fact that it's only a few years of data, why else might you not put a whole lot of stock in that dip? How confident are you that if you go down there this January, there will be 75 millimeters of rain? I see your head shake. Why not? This is the average. Why would you have low confidence that it would be average next time you go? Do you have a sense of how different it could be from year to year? You want to pass it behind you? Why?
There's confidence intervals on the.
Really wide confidence intervals. So these are the averages, but there's a lot of variation year to year. Part of that variation year to year that contributes to these wide confidence intervals is another climatic phenomenon called the El Nino Southern Oscillation. So normally, the Galapagos are, the waters around the Galapagos are, receive nutrients and support for the base of the food chain due to upwelling. And that upwelling comes in two forms. First, the whole Pacific. There are these trade winds that run along the equator that kind of push air from South America to Australia or to South Asia. So there's this upwelling of cool, nutrient-rich water here. A lot of those nutrients get used by plankton and up the food chain, giving you a really productive coast of South America. Meanwhile, the cool waters that were upwelled here and are supporting all that life are flowing along the equator, warming up, getting warmed at the surface by the sun, so that by the time you're over here, off the coast of Asia, there's a lot of rain, because the water is warm and it supports the formation of clouds and rainfall. Every 4 to 7 or 10 years or so, it's a little bit uneven, the trade winds that drive this weaken. When they weaken, you don't get upwelling here because they're not moving water out of the way to draw more water and nutrients. When that happens, when the trade winds slacken, the rain falls off the coast of South America at the Galapagos. So the difference between a normal year and an El Nino year is really significant with respect to rainfall, even though the islands haven't moved. We can see this pattern from satellite imagery. So this is an image showing the cold upwelling water here being blown by trade winds across the equator, leaving this cold tongue. When the trade winds slacken, warm water and high rainfall piles up near the Galapagos along the equator. That contributes to the high variation from year to year. When those trade winds slacken, and you don't get the upwelling, the waters around the islands don't have as much nutrients, and so they don't support as much phytoplankton or photosynthetic organisms. And you can see that difference here. This is a typical year in La Nina where there's upwelling providing nutrients off the the west coast of the Galapagos by the upwelling of the countercurrent, versus an El Nino year where there's not that upwelling. And if you're dependent on phytoplankton for your diet, this is a rough year. But if you're dependent on plants that need a lot of water on land, this might be a good year because there's going to be a lot more rainfall. How are we at on time? 110. Yeah. Now, on a specific island, rainfall isn't evenly distributed, even in a rainy season. Because of the shape of the islands and the nature of the gradient in temperature and humidity as you go up into the atmosphere, it's really the uplands that get the rainfall. It tends to be quite dry in the arid zone and along the coast, but in those islands that have a highland zone, that's where the rain tends to fall, and that supports the more lush vegetation. especially in the El Nino years. You guys think all islands are going to have the same 3 zones? Why not? Someone new. Or can you think of any islands where any of these zones wouldn't be present?
Hawaii?
Oh, I meant in the Galapagos. Yeah, for sure. There's my cursor.
The ones with not as like high mountains?
Yeah. And which ones don't have as high mountains? Yeah, the older ones, the ones that have eroded. So you tend to get variation in height from the west to the east, with the older ones being lower. The Galapagos Islands are volcanic, and this is something you probably gathered in the video. But what that means is they originated here de novo. They didn't separate off and drift by some continent, separating them from the mainland. Everybody who got here to survive on the terrestrial or the shallow waters around the islands, got there through what we call long distance dispersal. Rare events from a mainland source, whether it's South America or North America or Asia, probably mostly South America. They made it across this. And if you imagine that you've got a big population of some organism here, say birds, and every once in a while something awful happens, a storm, or they just get lost, what's probably going to happen to you if you end up out here as a bird? Right? So it's rare events and luck that gets you here. The alternate way to get new species into some different place besides long distance dispersal in biogeography terms is called vicariance. Vicariance is when some boundary forms or emerges to separate a continuous population into 2. There are many species that are closely related in South Australia and Tasmania to South America. Some of that is because of long distance dispersal driven by the currents around Antarctica, and some of that is because they descended from common ancestors that could walk across Antarctica when the continents were closer and the temperature was much warmer. Or fly, they didn't all walk. And of course, all the plants didn't walk either. We see that pattern mostly in the plants. But so this is a long distance dispersal event, and one of the most famous colonizers of the Galapagos Islands are the Galapagos giant tortoise. This is not a Galapagos giant tortoise. This is an Aldebrada tortoise. There are many different populations and species even of giant tortoises, particularly on islands. There were species on mainlands, but they're most common on islands. And one of the reasons they can get there is they can survive these, they can survive in the ocean for quite a while before they die. This is one that's covered in barnacles. This poor fellow was floating in the Indian Ocean for a really long time before it was found on the coast of Tanzania, because it got washed out to sea in Aldebrada, and it was in the ocean floating there, waiting to die basically for so long that it got barnacles, but then it luckily washed up and they found it. Other creatures, there's an example of one that you might see on a boat if you're super lucky and you're in Shark Alley here. Other organisms sometimes can be transmitted via long distance dispersal on vegetation mats. Sometimes clumps of vegetation held together by roots of plants get ripped off in a storm. I saw this in Panama, in the Panama Canal. There's a lake that supplies the canal to keep the water level good for ships. And sometimes a big storm will rip off a piece of vegetation as a mat, and off it goes. And if there's a lizard or a monkey on that, good luck. You might make it, you might not. Sometimes they do, and that's why islands are colonized. Did I see a question about any of that? Cool. The consequence of colonization is often endemic species on islands, and sometimes adaptive radiations or diversification of many new species from that colonizing species. So on the Galapagos, we have mammals, birds, reptiles, beetles, and snails. There's a few different category examples here. This column shows the number of species that are indigenous to the Galapagos Island. They're native there. Some of those are endemic. They're found nowhere else in the world. and there's quite a bit of endemic species on the Galapagos. Some of these lineages that colonized there and adapted to life on the Galapagos also diversified, producing many daughter species. So there are multiple species endemic lineages. So many species all more closely related to each other than they are to their ancestors on the mainland they came from. These are the organisms that diversified within the Galapagos Islands to life in the Galapagos. And tortoises were one of those. Let's see. 116. If you've got a species that has a certain diet and it makes it to a new island where there's no other or very few other competitors, and there's some source of food, so it's not just going to die, why would you end up with multiple species? If you've got this resource and you've got a reproductively viable population, the population will increase. Why would you get multiple species out of that? If you're really good at using your resources, then just grow your population. How do new species fit into that? Why might new species fit into that? Or another way to ask the question is, how do closely related species differ from one another?
Adaptations?
Adaptations? Let's build on that. Yep.
It's like they accidentally get separated somehow, and then like they live in different areas where they have to adapt to whatever situation they're in.
So separations and different situations leading to adaptation. What kinds of situations might vary in the Galapagos? Let's make it a little more practical. What kinds of situations might vary in the Galapagos?
Natural land barriers.
So barriers might contribute to the separation. But what about the landscape might vary? Instead of something that is present, either barrier is or isn't. How does landscape vary? Yeah.
Like, say there's like a eruption or something, it could like clear an area.
That's getting us into a discussion of disturbance, which we'll get to in this course. But think about it as a snapshot in time. How might a landscape in the Galapagos vary? Yeah.
Like the amount of vegetation in certain areas.
Yeah, the amount or types of vegetation might vary. The nature of the soils might vary. These are just natural variation across the landscape. Erosion is going to lead to different kinds of soils. Precipitation is going to lead to different kinds of vegetation. Whether you're on the east coast or the west coast of the shoreline might affect whether you're close to that upwelling source of nutrients or far from it. Really, the vegetation and the rainfall and soils is probably the best one to go for. In this case, when we talk about tortoises, as organisms adapt to these different situations, we can think about this concept of an ecological niche, which is the range of physical conditions where a species population is viable, where it can grow or sustain itself over time. Basically, there's a lot of dimensions to an ecological niche. What kind of diet can you eat, and is it present where you're living? What kind of range of temperatures can you tolerate? And are there extremes beyond that in the area where you're trying to make a living? Basically, anything that might affect your ability to survive and reproduce could be thought of as a dimension along which you might have a niche. One of the definitions of an ecological niche is a hyperbola defined by all the different aspects of your physical and chemical conditions that you need to survive. So organisms that are separated can sometimes undergo divergence in exactly what their niche is. They might utilize slightly different resources because they're more available, become adapted to using those resources, and then be different from their close relative that hasn't made that adaptation. So, this is what Charles Darwin had to say about the tortoises on the Galapagos. He noticed that the tortoises differ on the different islands. They're all closely related to each other, but they differ. not only in size, but in other characteristics, like what kinds of plants they eat, the shape of their shell, things like that. And what do you see here? Captain Porter has described those from Charles Island, and from the nearest island to it, Hood Island, as having their shells in the front thick and turned up like a Spanish saddle for a horse. While tortoises from James Island are rounder, darker colored, blacker, and also taste better when they're cooked. They eat a lot of tortoises. A lot of giant tortoises are gone today because people have overhunted them.
The sailors would put them on the ship because they can live for long periods of time without food and water, just as they do when they do these over ocean rafting episodes. So you could pick up a tortoise in the Galapagos and eat them off the coast of South Africa or coming up the coast of Africa because he was still around and kicking.
Just on the boat.
Just hanging out on the boat until it's time for dinner. It is sad, but it's true.
But if you were on a boat from South America to Australia, you'd like some fresh food.
It turns out that they rediscovered one of the species that they thought was extinct on another island in the Galapagos because presumably in transit going from one island to another, they must have dropped a tortoise overboard or something and it survived, ended up on an island that it wasn't native to, and just like in the last
Yeah, I read
decade,
about that like during COVID.
rediscovered the species that they thought was extinct because it wasn't on the island that it was supposed to be on.
They sequenced this genome and it grouped with a different island population.
So a small glimmer of happiness at the end of that story.
Here you can see an evolutionary tree depicting the relationships of the different Galapagos tortoises. So each word here at the end represents a tortoise from which they took DNA and compared that to the other tortoises. And how close you're grouped to other tortoises on this diagram tells you about how closely related they are. So we expect tortoises from similar islands to be grouped together here because they would have been descended from a colonization event at some time in the past. The length of the branches tells you about how different genetically they are. So these are all very, very similar to each other, whereas going from this species, Darwinii on Santiago, over to one of these species on the island of Isabella, you have to kind of go deep into the tree to get from one to the other. So that tells you that there's more genetic distance. The ancestor is further back in time. The other thing you can see with this image is some of that variation. Here's that high back, thick shell, saddle-like tortoise. These were adapted for eating higher vegetation. There's no other large mammals on the Galapagos. So there's all this vegetation up this high that no one's eating. So it's a great adaptation to be a tortoise to be able to push yourself up on your front legs, reach that neck out, have that shell out of the way, and access resources that nobody else is accessing. Especially up higher where there's more vegetation that's tall. Whereas these are other species that have that more round shape that we was talking about. Now, so this is a schematic view of the Galapagos showing the distribution of 17 different tortoises on the different islands. And what you can see is that the symbols here refer to similar tortoises. Let's see, I think I gotta go back one. Yeah. So this is a map showing all the different lineages of tortoises. Those that have the little dagger are extinct. So those are the ones that would have probably been eaten to extinction. The ones with the double daggers are where we suspect there are populations of tortoises from various lines of evidence, but don't have direct evidence of them. And then the ones that don't have the daggers are the ones that are still alive today. And you can see the location of the volcanoes on the youngest island, Isabella. I think there's an active volcano on Ferdinandia, but it's not shown in this figure. I could be mistaken about that.
Where's this?
Isn't there an active on
Yeah,
Ferdinandia?
yeah, there are three volcanoes on Isabella and one on Fernandina.
Oh, so this doesn't mean active. This is just the locations of the calderas. That's why I was confused. So on the different islands, you can see that there are different populations of tortoises occupying different climatic niches that happen to associate very well with the elevation on those islands. So on the shorter islands, we tend to have fewer kinds, but on the larger islands, they're differentiated along that elevation axis. Here are those same tortoises again, showing you the pictures of the saddleback evolving multiple times on different islands. Where there's vegetation, you tend to have the saddlebacks on the islands that have the higher elevation and the more lush vegetation. And we see the same pattern of groups of closely related endemic species on the Galapagos Islands in other organisms. Here we see it in snails, different island and land snails on the Galapagos. Let's see, what do I have here? Snails trying to make it at different altitudes have different selection pressures. I mean, there's no shrikes hunting them, but they have to deal with other aspects of their environment that are going to affect their fitness. Where there's plenty of moisture, rounded shells work just fine, but at lower altitudes, where conditions are more arid, it's drier for the length of the year. A well-rounded snail with a big opening here will risk drying out. So they tend to become smaller and more conservative with their water, adapted to those drier conditions. And we can see here that if you match up the islands, that the different adaptations to either wetter or drier conditions show up in closely related groups. So we've got differentiation of those two forms, the dry adapted and the wet adapted forms, on each island over and over and over again. It's iterating the same kind of evolutionary story. We also see adaptations like this in plants, especially in cacti, where in drier environments they'll be more succulent, and in wetter environments they might be more leafy or more able to lose less water conservative. So in wetter areas they don't have to conserve as much water, whereas in drier areas they're more adapted to the cactus-like growth form. We see variation on these islands often of there being herbs, shrubs, trees, and vines, all closely related to each other. And then we've got, even in the mangroves, different populations around the shorelines, the shallow waters of each different island, sort of evolving over and over again as similar forms. All right, so we've got about 5 minutes, and I want to be able to walk through this. Let's see here. Okay, so we'll probably have to finish this next time, but if we take the idea of diversification, of creating many daughter lineages from a colonizing ancestor out of the picture for a moment, and just think about the process of populating islands with these long distance dispersal events. What kinds of things do you think might affect the number of species that can successfully colonize an island? Start with one back here.
It might depend on like how much vegetation is there when it gets there, if there's like things for it to eat.
Right, so yes, that's a good one. Once you get there, can you survive? Is there the vegetation and environment that you need to survive? Good. But let me just sort of guide the next responses so that all networks together. What about getting there first, no matter what the vegetation looks like? What might affect that?
Can you survive?
Like, do you have a way to get there?
Yeah, so some dispersal ability. Okay, so dispersal ability is a good one. What's an organism that would have a low dispersal ability compared to a high dispersal ability?
A squirrel.
Versus,
Compared to like a bird.
Yeah, okay. So flying things, volant things, are more likely to colonize islands far away than terrestrial things. And you want to expand a little
I
bit?
was just saying, can you just survive?
Can you survive the trip? Yeah, for sure. Things that have longer lifespan, things that have fat storage, right? Those kinds of things like the tortoise, are more likely to make it. Anything else? Yeah.
The number of predators you might have.
Again, once you get there, whether you can survive depends on if you have the resources and are you going to get eaten by something. But before you get there, think about, remember how we tore apart the dartboard analogy? We can actually use a dartboard analogy again. If you're casting birds or tortoises into the vast Pacific Ocean, think about those islands as a dartboard. What kind of a board is going to be easier to hit? Okay, good. So island area matters. Island area is also going to influence how much vegetation and other resources are on that island for you once you get there. Let's see.
Would climate affect one?
Yeah, for sure. Climate's going to affect what kinds of plants and animals are there already, what kinds of resources are available.
The rainfall?
Yeah. I suppose I'll end here, as we'll pick it up next time, that there is in fact a general relationship between the area of islands in the world and the number of species on them. There's a little bit of a funny graph. Notice, what's weird about the x-axis here? Say it again? Yeah, this one, this on the bottom. What's odd about that axis? Anybody do? A big range and
It gets exponentially big.
it gets exponentially bigger. Notice we're adding zeros. It's not 10, 20, 30, 40, right? It's 100, 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000, 100,000. And the same is true here. It's a logarithmic scale. So there's a lot of variation here that's compressed because the difference between 10,000 and 100,000 is much bigger than the difference between 10,000 and 10,100, which would be not here. But there's this general relation between island area and richness. And we're going to build on this with a little graphical model on. Right. Any questions? You got your interesting things about the Galapagos. I know we didn't talk about them, partly because I wanted to get through the lizards. But just, I guess, hand them to me since we're using that space for the birds. As you,
I can move the birds.
Great conversation.
I moved it to